good. Welcome to the 2021 IPF virtual conference. As most of you are aware, this is the second consecutive year that we haven't been able to host a full face-to-face IPF conference due to COVID. We then planned and scheduled 8 regional conferences, which sadly we weren't able to go ahead with, also due to restrictions. So here we are eventually virtually, as we have become accustomed to over the last 2 years. So we have 8 sessions over the next 2 days, and we hope and believe that you'll find the topics and the content engaging, interesting, and useful. Just a few housekeeping items before we kick off. As I mentioned earlier, please make sure that your username on Zoom is your first and last name for attendance purposes. If we see Skippy's iPad, we have no idea who that is. Please remain on mute as far as you can during the presentations, especially if you've got a really loud ringtone on your phone, or if you have kitchen renovations going on in the background. Also, please leave questions to the end of the session. We plan to have a question session at the end. If you want to, during the run of the session, you can post a question to the chat room, and then we'll try to get to most of those as we get to the end. And also, as you heard earlier, please take into consideration that these sessions are all recorded. And remember that as we go forward through the 2 days, that each session has a separate Zoom meeting, so you have to leave each session and then re-enter the next session through that specific link. It's just an easier way to record and record attendance as well. So let's get straight into it. The first session is Brett Newman, assisted by Mike Tibbetts. Brett's well known. He's an experienced IPF rigger from Downward Trend. Now, it's become apparent recently that many jumpers are using equipment without understanding the design parameters or the limitation, specifically with regard to MARDs and Skyhooks, also AADs. So Brett's gonna present on equipment choices and how that affect outcomes, and by basically answering the question if the choices that you are making are the safest for you and the type of jumps that you do. So Brett, over to you.
Awesome, mate. Thanks very much for the introduction. G'day, everybody. Today's a fairly informal. If people have sat in on one of my seminars before, you'll find I generally try and keep them interactive. So Charles asked for questions at the end, but just type them in to the chat room as you want. And if I'm not seeing them, I'm sure Ria or Charles or Mike will pick up on them, and we can then address those questions as we go through. The big topic, obviously, is choosing the right equipment. And I wrote an article recently called the MARD effect, and that kind of touched on that topic. So we're going to cover off on some of that today and look at a couple of specific things that I think probably are where information's lacking or where knowledge is lacking out there. So the big things we're seeing right now, though, is the change in the sport and how the equipment's changing, how the sport's evolved to a point where we used to have rigs that would be able to do a multitude of different things. When I started jumping, we could use the same rig for freefall and CRW. We had big canopies in our containers, so it wasn't so gear specific. But as the sport has evolved, the gear has become much more specific to the discipline that you're participating in. And we see this primarily in, obviously, free flying and wingsuiting. These are probably 2 of the more really gear specific ones, apart from things like CRW, which that's another topic which we can look at later on. Highlighting a couple of incidents that we've had recently, we're finding that because a lot of people head down the road of free flying early on, it seems to be the most popular discipline at this point, and then people are also branching off into wingsuiting. Equipment in these 2 disciplines can be quite different, similar but different. We've got to start now looking at focusing on the equipment that we want to spend most of our time on. We all wanted to get smaller rigs, more comfortable rigs. The manufacturers have built equipment now but what we can also do is we can inhibit ourselves or put ourselves in danger if we're using that equipment in the wrong way. And to look at this, we'll go back to an incident that happened over in WA to do with wingsuiting. Choosing the right size reserve for the right discipline basically is a big thing right now. And in the article I wrote, The Mard Effect, I highlighted a number of things that were really specific to a probable cause for that incident. What we're finding is that people want small gear, but they don't understand the parameters of the equipment that they've put on their back. I jump a small main, but my reserve is significantly bigger just based on the safety margin that I wanted to build into my equipment. I have an 86 layer main canopy and an Optimum 143 reserve. And that was solely based on me being able to have a survivable landing if I was unconscious under my reserve. I went from a smaller, I had a one and I upsized to a 143. And as we get older, I don't know whether I've become more cautious, but I started thinking about a little bit more longevity in the sport, and I wanted to be able to keep jumping, and I didn't want to get damaged on a landing under a reserve. So not just that, we also now need to look at a couple of different things. And so what I'm going to do right now, I'm just going to share a screen, and I'm just to explain a couple of things about the equipment that are really specific to modern equipment such as MARDs and AADs. All right, the AAD thing we'll talk about in a little bit, but I'm just going to share my screen here, and you'll get to see my desktop. This is a photo that was taken of me at Funny Farm. You can see in the background over here, I've dragged the water and then I've reared the canopy up. This is a layer 86, and at about 15 feet off the deck, I've cut away. So you can see here that the Skyhook that's in my Vector rig is activating the launch of my reserve free bag at this point. The reason that I've got this up so that you can see, just because later on we're going to talk about why we get line twists on reserves when we have Skyhooks and why we don't get line twists. In this photo, you'll see the pilot chute out to the side out here. The Skyhook at this point here is loaded and is starting to lift off the free bag. In a normal Skyhook deployment, this would give me a pretty on-heading opening in general terms. I'm not spinning, I don't have any inertia or rotation or momentum other than just downward force. During a MARD deployment, the pilot chute over here will sometimes get low, which means it catches air. It might inflate. And what that does is it snatches the Skyhook or the MARD, which is at this point here, where my cursor is, it will snatch that off the lanyard. This is the RSL and the MARD lanyard here. So it'll just snatch that off. And at that point, as soon as the MARD lanyard releases from the Skyhook or whatever the MARD device is, then any inertia, if you're spinning or rotating, then transfers to the jumper, okay? And the momentum carries on at that point. So if you are rotating at a high rate, then this is when we get probable line twists on the reserve, because the momentum transfers through and any momentum is then carried on. And we'll often see, and we'll see in a video soon, that often the reserve will come out, it deploys straight, but then the momentum of the jumper induces the line twists during the opening of the reserve. Okay, so what I'll just drag up now is we'll have a look at a PowerPoint here. Where did that go? Into my Google Drive. Sorry guys, this was sitting open just before. Open up. Oh, No, wrong one. Sorry. So good. Oh, as you'll see, I might be okay on sewing machines, but when it comes to working computers, I tend to lack a little bit. Right. So I'm just going to quickly scroll through to, we'll come back to these photos in a minute. All right. What we're seeing here is a high-speed malfunction on a 60, I think it's a 67. All right. And we can see most of those line twists actually occurred after the reserve was deployed. So there was, I think, half a line twist during the initial part of the deployment. The Skyhook acted, it was a full Skyhook deployment. So the free bag was with the main canopy when it landed. And because he was rotating at such a high rate, as the reserve was deploying, the momentum that was in his body caused the line twists to be induced into the canopy. All right, does that make sense to everybody? What we'll see in another video, in the next video along. Kill the tunes. All right, so another high-speed rotation in a wingsuit. And you'll get to see this in slow-mo in a second. And this is where I believe Skyhooks can be life-saving. It's not all about low to the ground. It's also proximity to other skydivers. All right, this is me. This is a malfunction that actually happened to me. If I hadn't had a Skyhook on, that jumper that you saw go past me, I would have gone straight through him on my back in a wingsuit. And the last I'd seen him, he was about 1,500 feet below me, and that was how fast I closed in. So Skyhooks and MARDs certainly have their place. But in saying that, you also saw an Optimum 143 reserve deploy, okay? When I was jumping at this time, I probably weighed around about 90 kilograms. So I was at the upper limit of the reserve, but not really exceeding the limit of the reserve. All right. PD talk about the loadings of their reserve, and in their manual, they talk specifically to wing loadings above 1.4 and below the maximum. So we're going to have a look now. We're going to go back through a couple of the photos that we've got here. And I don't know if any of you understand how the warning label on a reserve works. This is for an Optimum 113 reserve. We can see it has multiple. If you look in here, it's a little bit faint, but we can see in the limitations here, it has skill and operating limits. Okay, the operating weights below are listed for jumpers and their clothing and their equipment. Okay, so the maximum loading, the maximum weight for the Optimum 113 reserve is 254 pounds or 115 kgs. Okay, they're saying that that's a survivable opening at that weight. They're not saying that the reserve will perform that well at that weight. That's the maximum load, okay? The expert weight for a 113 reserve is 169 pounds or 77 kilograms. That's all up weight out the door, okay? And if we look at what the manual states on wing loadings above 1.4 and below the maximum, this is a very high wing loading. Turn rates, forward speed, and rates of descent will be very high. A very high experience level is required to get an acceptable landing, even under ideal landing conditions. Okay, the control range may be very short, with stalls happening very abruptly and without warning. The situation can be very dangerous. So they go on and they explain a little bit more about it. So trying to put down a reserve when you're land a reserve when you're over this weight, expert weight. So, you know, you got to start looking at ourselves, and this is probably a big problem that we all fall into. And I know I used to, is that I was a much better skydiver. Well, I thought I was a much better skydiver than I actually was, you know? So, and that's the case in a lot of circumstances. So again, looking at an Optimum reserve, they say the maximum weight, 254 pounds, expert weight, 80 kilograms, all up, out the door. If you've got an OP 126 and you're over 80 kilograms, okay, if you have line twists on your main and you get induced line twists on your reserve from momentum, like we saw in the video, chances are you could end up in an asymmetric position, meaning the reserve will start to spin. And the problem with this is kicking out a line twists as a reserve starts to rotate, and the more it rotates, the harder it is to kick out of the line twist. Okay, as speed builds up, the more asymmetric or bent out of shape your reserve gets as it loads up. Okay, OP 143, 91 kg expert. Okay, advanced. If you only have a few hundred jumps, I would put you in the intermediate to advanced range. And for a 143 reserve, that's 75 kgs. You know, intermediate, 65 kgs. They're saying if you're past these weight limits, then the performance of the parachute is going to be not what you expect. And we all got to remember as well, when you're flying a reserve canopy, it's not a canopy that you've flown in most cases before. So you're not familiar with the performance envelope. You have a very limited time to figure out how the canopy flies and performs and lands. And often when we're dealing with a reserve, it's at the worst possible time. You know, you might end up off the drop zone, unfamiliar landing area, going downwind. It may even be at sunset or even on a night jump. Okay. Now you got to stop and start to consider, is this the situation I want to put myself in? All right. So this is what we're talking about when are the choices that we're making the safest choices. You know, we can choose any type of canopy we want. We really can. People talk about downsizing a lot, but I'm yet to read any documentation anywhere that states you must downsize. Okay, if you enjoy flying a 170 or a 150, there is no need for you to downsize to a smaller canopy if you enjoy that. Okay, peer pressure in some circumstances is often the driving factor to why people will downsize. Some people want to be awesome canopy pilots and they downsize accordingly because that's their goal. All right, but that's not always the case. Often people are told that they're wing loading. At their wing loading, they could be jumping a smaller canopy. That is not a reason to downsize. Okay, wing loading is not the basis for getting a smaller main parachute generally. Okay, unless you're at the top end of your game, wing loading then is used as a guide in performance, weight, and speed, and all of those kind of things. When you're in an intermediate to novice range, if your experience, number one, your experience is the thing that should be basing that's what you should be basing your canopy choice on. Also, you know, with wing loading, it doesn't take into consideration location, atmospheric conditions, or any of these other things. So ultimately, when you talk about changing the canopy or choosing the right canopy for you, it should be all about your experience level and how comfortable you are and how safe other people perceive you to be as well. And that's the thing. There should always be discussion with the experienced people at the drop zone or your instructors or your mates, you know. So don't make any choices without having considered all. And when I say consider all, it's like all as in, what do I want to do? What do I want my career in skydiving to be? What's the focus on the most? Okay, if having a small rig is going to assist you as far as free flying, you think it's going to make you free fly better, then you need to sit down and consider, okay, the weight limit of the reserve. What are you going to be comfortable landing off the drop zone going downwind at sunset under? You know, how many times have we considered that? So we need to consider the reserve, number one. Okay, big contributing factor, the reserve size and loading in the West Australia wingsuiting fatality. And number two, we have safety systems the manufacturer build, like MARDs. The MARDs in our equipment that we can get now, there's a variety of different ones out there. There's 9, 10, 11 different types of MARDs. They all work in a similar way, okay? But in most cases, the design is that the primary deployment device. I'm just going to go back to my screen, wherever it is. I'm going to escape this. Sorry, guys. The primary deployment device is this. Okay, can you guys see? If you can't see the pilot chute, okay, that's the primary deployment device. So at any point during a reserve deployment or a MARD deployment, if the pilot chute gets low, catches air, that will generally override the Skyhook, the MARD, the whatever the manufacturer's called their MARD device. All right, so it'll snatch it off. All right, and then you're back into what's basically a RSL deployment. So you have to choose whether a MARD is appropriate for what you're doing. In most cases, MARDs are a good choice. I use a MARD on my equipment when I'm doing specific skydives. Like when I'm wingsuiting, I like to have a MARD on. Why? Because in my mind, I think I would much rather be kicking out of line twists on my reserve, because I've chosen a reserve that I think I fall within the limitations on. I'd rather be kicking out a line twist on my reserve than fighting to get stable in my wingsuit and to deploy my reserve in a stable position. The other choices that we need to look at are RSLs. You know, RSLs have been around for a long time, and a MARD is just an extension to an RSL. They work similar but different. They're not the same. So you've got to have a look at whether you're going to be doing CRW or doing high performance canopy piloting. When I'm doing high performance canopy piloting, I take my RSL, the RSL shackle off, so that it just makes me feel a little bit more comfortable being around other canopies. So if I do have an entanglement, then I'd be able to cut away and fall away from the entanglement and then deploy my reserve. All right. So there's a time and a place. So by having a MARD in my rig, it doesn't take options away from me. It just gives me another choice. All right. And that's the big thing. We've got to look at the choices that we're giving ourselves. What we also want to look at now is the AADs that we're putting into our equipment as well. There's 3 common AADs on the market that are in use. We have the Cypress, the Vigil, and the M2. All of these come in multi-modes. They all have baseline settings in them. That means the lowest level that they'll activate at, but they also all have the ability to be have that activation level raised up. So we need to stop and think about whether we want to raise the level of the activation, and by doing so, what risks do we put ourselves at by doing that? You know, if I've raised the activation level, that means I've also it also means that the whole window of activation has been raised as well. That means that I have to have my main deployed higher, so I need to build another safety margin in at deployment. Okay, so I raise my hard decks. You know, so every choice that we make has a knock-on effect. So we've got to think about where we want to go with the choices. And this is, as instructors, if you're an instructor and you're advising your students or your novice skydivers on your drop zone, you know, we want to be pointing them in directions of what's going to be the next step for you, what's going to be the safest choice of equipment, not planning. I often see people planning too far ahead, thinking, okay, I'm going to buy a rig now that'll fit a 150 in it. I'm jumping a 190, but I think in 6 months' time, I'm going to be wanting to jump a 150. So we kind of need to think, what's the appropriate equipment for what you're doing right now? Does that make sense to people? If this doesn't make sense, just chuck a comment down saying, look, you disagree with what I'm saying. And remember, a lot of this stuff is just from my experience and my opinion. If you have a point of view that you think that that I'm not hitting, then please let us know in the comments. I was asked by Mike Tibbetts earlier today about whether I have MARDs on, like when I'm doing tandems, and why I have it and why would I not have it, or when would a situation arise that I wouldn't have it. I would generally with tandem have my Skyhook on. The reason being is that it gives me the choice to disconnect it. If I've got it disconnected before I leave the aircraft, I don't have a choice because it's almost impossible to hook up while you're out, once you're out the door. There's very few situations during tandem where, I feel that I would not require or I put myself at risk by having it on. Because I'm also responsible for another person's life, I want to get if there's an emergency, I want to get my reserve out as quickly as I can so I can deal with any other issues that may occur. So we've just got to remember what a MARD's for. A MARD's not about being able to smoke it low and dump your reserve at a low altitude and get a good opening. Okay, the MARD is designed to give us more time. Okay, to activate the reserve as soon as safely possible, to get the reserve canopy open so we can start making those choices of where am I going to land, what direction, do I have any injuries that need to be dealt with, any of these kind of things that may arise. So it's all about time, all right? So in most circumstances, I'll have the Skyhook on. The only time I generally disconnect my Skyhook is once I'm actually under canopy. If the winds are up on the beach or wherever I'm landing and I think that I may not make it to a catch or something, then I disconnect it so that I don't accidentally deploy my reserve once I land. On my sport rig, again, I jump with the Skyhook on, and like I said, I have a layer 86 main canopy, and I jump with that on, except for when I'm going to go and do XRW, CP with other pilots like flocking jumps and close canopy work. But in general, I normally will have it on. And I build into my system, like my emergency procedures, the disconnecting of the shackle. Okay, so when I'm doing my emergency procedure drills, I also look at my RSL shackle and I practice grabbing it so that I know where it's going to be if I need to disconnect it. And I know of a number of jumpers that have had a high deployment and they've had their MARD systems on, they've deployed high and they've gone into line twists and they didn't want to cut away and have a high deployment on their reserve. They wanted to free fall for a little bit more, and the choice was there. I don't know the situations, but they disconnected during, they might have been on their back. They saw that they didn't want to deploy that high on their reserve, disconnected the shackle, then pulled the cutaway handle, got stable, rolled over, and then deployed their reserve when they were comfortable. But that's generally at a much higher altitude. We're not talking about down low. Okay, I've just got a couple of questions come in. A question about Sigma Tandem from Luke Oliver and Skyhook, please. My understanding is that UPT regard the Skyhook as an integral part of the Sigma system. Confirm or deny. It is mandatory. Okay, you can't get a Sigma system without a Skyhook in it. And as part of their manufacturer's requirements, you are required to use it. And under the FAA ruling, like in the States, USPA regulate the skydiving in the US, and they they fall to what the manufacturer state, and if the manufacturer states that the Skyhook needs to be attached, then that's what happens. Okay, you can't disconnect it unless you have an exemption or any I don't know what other reason you'd be able to get away without jumping it. If the manufacturer states that you've got to have it on in the US, the USPA mandate it. Here in Australia, we have an op reg that states tandem masters must connect an RSL on a tandem descent unless the CI under whose authority the descent is being conducted has approved otherwise. What else would you say to an Australian tandem master who is Skyhook hesitant? As I said earlier, Luke, the Skyhook doesn't take anything away from me as a user. It gives me another choice. Okay, like I said, I can leave the aircraft with it on and I can disconnect it at any time I choose during the skydive if we've drilled to do that. okay? And that's got to be a part of your emergency procedure, so you're aware of where it is, all right? So if I want it off under canopy, I'll take it off under canopy. If I want it off just prior to landing, I'll take it off prior to landing. Why would I jump without it? I don't see a need to. I know there's been situations where there's been canopy collisions, accidental, but even in that situation, having a Skyhook on could be the difference between life and death. You make the choice at the time. Could be a time that you want to disconnect it. Might be a good time or a great time that you had it on. Okay. Another question coming from Andrew Barker. Was told that the main and the reserve shouldn't be too different in size because of a 2-out situation. The discussion behind that is a little bit different because we have high performance canopies now and we have low performance reserves. Okay, you can't regulate getting the same size, and a 2-out situation is a rare occurrence. And I'll be honest, I've never had a 2-out, and I've done over 13,000 jumps. Doesn't mean that it won't happen, but again, you must drill, like your emergency procedures, you drill the scenarios. Okay, the APF's done a lot of work. There's lots of information out there on 2-out situations and how to deal with each one. Okay, so again, the recommendation is to read the documentation, ask the questions. Okay, a similar size main and a similar size reserve, it's not always a feasible thing. Okay, it's just not practical today. When you're starting out in your career as a skydiver, absolutely. You know, if you're jumping a 170 main, why would I want a 150 reserve? If I'm allowed or approved to jump a 170, I'm not, and I don't understand the theory behind people saying, oh, they can have a 150 reserve because it's a docile canopy, but it's still only 150 square feet. Okay, if you're approved to jump a 170 and they're happy for you to jump a 170, then your reserve should be a 170. Okay, so as an instructor, you need to think about that, right? And we've got to, as instructors, again, why do I jump with a Skyhook on doing tandems? I hate to say it, but liability is always an issue. Okay, we've got to stop and look as the instructor, who will point the finger at me if I had a choice to use a safety system and I chose not to. What are my reasons? And I need to have some really good reasons why I think that that safety system wasn't applicable to me, right? And I've been involved in some cases with the APF, some court cases, and it's difficult to fight some of these things when people choose because I'm a good skydiver. It's very hard to defend that, right? So get the information, make an informed decision. It's the best piece of advice I can give to anybody is an informed decision is the best decision, okay? Might not be my choice. I mean, my choice is my choice on the information I have, and the choices that you make are based on the information that you're given as well. All right, what do we got? Phil Black, regarding the RSL shackle and tandems, I would also recommend that the tandem masters practice deploying the reserve by using the RSL shackle as a deployment handle. Not many situations require this, but I know it is not rehearsed very much. I've got to disregard, that one's a tough one, Phil. The manufacturer does not recommend that you do that. It's not practiced anymore. Earlier on, we would use it. I guess in the back of your mind, it's a thought, but it's certainly not the way that it used to be. We don't. Yeah, I don't recommend trying to as a last resort. But I mean, I start pulling handles if I'm in an emergency situation and I think things are going bad. Trust me, I'll pull every handle that's available to me. But as a matter of course, the manufacturer doesn't recommend using the RSL because the MARD system is attached to the Sky. The pull force is massively high. Okay, for you to get the leverage that you require to extract it will take quite a bit of force. and you could be wasting time in altitude trying to do that. But that is a topic of discussion. Yeah, left hand's disabled. What do you do? Well, what does the manufacturer recommend you do if you got your left hand disabled, Phil? They've got they have an emergency flow chart that we need to look at. I mean, that one could go on for a little bit. There's a few things in there. Going on back to choosing your AADs, I'm just going to jump back into that for a second. Talking about equipment-specific things, we now have available multi-mode AADs. All right, using the AAD in the right mode for the right job. You've got to look at the high-speed mode. Even in high-speed modes now, the canopies are designed to fly at ultra-high speeds. They're still seeing activations in the speed mode on Cypress, the extreme mode on the Vigils, and the same thing on the M2s. Okay, so it's choosing the right mode for the right canopy that you're jumping, but also not choosing the wrong mode. Okay, I see many jumpers arrive at the drop zone or at an event that I'm doing gear checks on, and they've got their AAD set for speed, and they say, oh yeah, because I'm jumping a cross brace canopy. Just because you jump a cross brace canopy doesn't mean that you need to have it on speed. Okay, you've got to look at what happens when you take your AAD and you put it into the speed mode. You now increase all of your values. Okay, you increase the height that you need for the activation to happen. You need to increase your free fall speed for the activation to happen. So if you're under canopy and you have a collision or a canopy collapse or a situation where you need the AAD to activate, okay, you need to fall for a longer amount of time if you've got it set at speed, because the speed value is a higher value. All right, 78 meters per second is the standard value for most AADs in the expert pro mode. 96 to 102 mile an hour or meters per second is your speed mode. Okay, that means you be falling for maybe another 50, maybe 50 to 100 feet before you'll see an activation. And that 50 to 100 feet could really be critical. Okay, so there's always a knock-on effect for the equipment that we're choosing. So, this is what I impress on people. When you've got an AAD, most times people have never seen the instruction manual. Get the manual. All the manufacturers have their manuals online now. You don't need it. If you bought secondhand gear and it's got an AAD that you've never read the manual, go and get the manual off the website, read through it, start to understand the parameters, the activation parameters, or whether you're standing straight up during the deployment of your canopy. Now, what is the height value? Because the value changes depending on whether you're belly to earth or back to earth or standing up. The values change. So your activation height changes with it. Okay, so it's important that we understand the parameters of all of our equipment. We jump our mains every time we go skydiving, but at some point, we're relying on equipment on our back that we either haven't used before or we just don't understand it. Okay, and ignorance is not an excuse when somebody gets hurt or somebody dies, or somebody like me has to stand up in court and go, well, they just didn't read the manual. And if it's an instructor, it's very difficult for us to defend somebody that has just been ignorant and not read the instruction manual. Especially as an instructor, we should have all got to the point where we should be familiar with the equipment manuals that we're using. All right. Just having a quick look at some of the questions coming in. Do I see much difference in the types of MARDs? No, well, yes and no. There's different operating parameters for different MARDs. So when I say different operating parameters, the manufacturers design them in slightly different ways. The Skyhook was designed so that, like I said, the pilot chute will release as soon as it gets loaded. It will pull the Skyhook off the Skyhook lanyard. The trap for the Mirage system is a capture system. So it's like a noose. It nooses and knots around the bridle. It won't release. Once it's locked onto the bridle, it's not letting it go. Okay. I see benefits. I like that, the fact that it doesn't let it go, but I'm not the manufacturer. You know, the manufacturer builds things to the limitations that they want. And that's how they design the systems. There's, like I said, there's about 9 or 10 different types of MARDs on the system. They have all been tested thoroughly. So do I prefer one over the other? I can't say I do. I mean, I'm most familiar with the Skyhook because it's been around the longest. And a number of manufacturers have licensed it to use it in their equipment. So it's the most common one on the market. There's new ones being released all the time. So Aerodyne's just released their Aeromart, which is in some ways similar to the Wings boost system. Okay, so they're similar and different. So, but in general, I think they have a time and a place. The MARDs aren't the be all and end all, but they have, you know, everything has a time and a place. So make an informed decision on whether you think it's good for you. Okay. Just quickly having a quick read through the questions. Lee Barraclough for the APF should send some of these AA parameters and how to find them in questions for A, B, C, D, etc. exams for training programs. Yeah, look, the APF is always looking at improving the way that we present information, and the exams are being upgraded as they are time available. So I think the information, we're probably due for another upgrade in some of the exam information and questions. So I'm sure that the safety and training manager's on it. He's a fairly thorough man, so he'll be reviewing the current exams and looking to see where improvements can be made. Does anybody else have any questions for me right now? I'm kind of starting to hit the limit of our time, so I'd like, if anybody's got any questions, just throw them at me now. I'll be happy to answer.
There's a question that you've missed. Dave asked, have you applied an activation offset to your own AAD that's different to the manufacturer's default setting?
No, I haven't. I use a Vigil in my gear, so the activation altitude is 820 feet already. In my equipment, like I said, no, but in equipment that I've set up and used, yes, I've set activation altitudes. We use for keg jumps out at farm for the recovery systems, we are regularly offsetting them to activate lower than normal height because we put a round parachute onto the kegs and objects that we drop. And I set them at about 660 feet, and we've never had a failure, and they are very accurate. I can say that they're quite spectacular to watch going off at around 660 feet above the ground. So, Mark Gasley.
G'day.
Hey, mate.
Sorry,
how are you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, sorry, I only just joined the meeting because I couldn't get in before. But someone mentioned something about exams. I just had an idea a little while ago about when pilots have to sit exams regularly, once a year. We get our license, so we give licenses out and we can examine people and things like that. But then there's no recurrency training or examination. Maybe we should. It's just an idea. We should be examining people, even licensed jumpers. We examine tandem masters for certain aspects of their job. Maybe people should have to sit a test yearly or biannually. Licensed jumpers as well. I don't know if it's relevant, but I think that was something I was talking about examinations before.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's something that you put to the safety and training manager. He would probably be interested to hear your thoughts on it. So, but as far as for instructors, we've got the revalidation process that we have, and in a lot of countries they don't even have that. So once you've got your license, as long as you say you remain current, You don't have to be tested on any of the rules or regulations to see whether you've been upskilling or done any professional development. So I think in a lot of ways the APF leads the way as in instructor training. So, but there's always room for improvement. So, anybody else? Looks like I'm out of time, guys. Thank you very much for listening in.
Thanks, Brett.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brett. As always, very informative, a lot of information in there. And yeah, this is a topic that we can carry on for hours and hours, and there's a lot more to learn and to be said. So I'd encourage everyone to either speak to Brett or your local rigger or somebody who knows about it. There's a lot of information available online as well. But yeah, make sure that when you make decisions, make sure it's an informed decision. Thank you very much for your time, Brett. And thanks everyone for attending.